We're talking about ideation tools, and Scamper is the ideation tool that I want to talk to you about today. Scamper is an acronym and an ideation tool that was developed by Alex Osborne. The purpose of Scamper is to look at different ways in which you can view a problem or an opportunity. Remember that we're using divergent practices, so we want to have lots of different lenses to how we view a particular problem or an opportunity. And what Scamper does, it gives you different lenses. So you're going to have a different lens for the S, the C, the A, the M, the P, and so on. Scamper, to use it effectively, you're going to need your vision board canvas, and you're going to share with the team that you will be engaging the ideation process with the vision that you're hoping to achieve. Because that vision, or the problem definition, whatever you like to call it, it sets the parameters for what you're trying to achieve. It's kind of like your anchor or your guide. Scamper will help you by giving you some structured questions to ask in your ideation session. So it's a really good tool to use if you're new to ideation, because when you're looking at the Scamper canvas, you'll see the questions are there for you, and I'll go through them with you in this video. The great thing about the Scamper canvas is you can use it for anything. So if you're trying to develop a new systems or new processes or new products or services or offerings, if you're trying to uncomplicate things or reduce costs or whatever it is you're trying to utilize, to do, Scamper is a tool that you can probably do it for. I've even used Scamper with small businesses and a couple of medium ones as well, where they're actually trying to redevelop or reshape, I should say, or some would call it, it's actually known as business model innovation. So what they're trying to do is relook at how their business model actually works and reshape that, and what does that look like going into the future, 5, 10 years down the track, or even 20 years down the track. And you can use Scamper to help you navigate this process. Now, I know in the past I've suggested that you take about 30 minutes in your ideation session. So with Scamper, we're talking about 7 letters here. So if you allocate 5 minutes per letter and taking into account the switching in between letters, I would suggest about 40 minutes is probably, you know, maybe even 45, but it is probably a little longer session than your others. But keep it short, sharp, and simple. And my suggestion is allocate 5 minutes per letter. So what do the letters stand for? The first letter, S, in Scamper stands for substitute. Questions to consider asking when facilitating an ideation workshop include: what can be substituted? What can be used in its place? What can be involved instead? Which processes could be used instead? Or what materials can be used? These are just some examples of questions that can be used. Consider what substitutes could be used instead, or what alternatives could be used. These are just examples, and what sort of questions you ask will depend on what your particular situation is and what vision or problem you've defined or opportunity you're seeking. An example where I've used substitute is finding alternatives to single-use plastics, where we can use bamboo for utensils instead of plastics. The C in Scamper is for combine. Questions to ask when facilitating an ideation session workshop include what can be combined, what can be mixed, how might certain parts be connected, which purposes should be combined or could be combined. An example where using the combine is to think about services that have been combined. For example, combining CRM with email marketing with a website platform, which is now commonplace, but once it wasn't. When we're talking about the A in Scamper, we're talking about adapt. And questions we might ask when facilitating an ideation session would include something like, how can we adapt in this situation? Or what can we adapt? Or is there anything similar in the market that can be adapted and applied to an existing problem or to this particular problem? An example is using white vinegar for cleaning purposes to remove bacteria and hard water deposits when cleaning. The M in Scamper stands for modified. Questions we might ask when facilitating ideas around modify in a session would include things like what modifications could be introduced, can we modify the meaning or the colour or the shape, or how might we modify workflow processes or the price or a container or our onboarding practices, for example. An example where we might modify a product or something could be, if we think about a beverage, which is why I use this particular figure, is that we're now seeing beverage shapes allow us to easily grip the middle of the bottle to make it more comfortable when we drink from the bottle. These are things that are now fairly commonplace, but again, once upon a time they weren't. When we're talking about the P in Scamper, we're talking about put to other uses. And questions we might ask when facilitating an ideation session using Scamper and the P would be things like, for what purposes could it be used in its present state? For what purposes could it be used if we changed it a bit? An example that I can think of using put to other uses, again it's something that's now commonplace in the market but it once wasn't, is bicarbonate soda. So bicarbonate soda is found both in the cleaning and in the cooking aisle, and that was because it was once only ever found in the cooking aisle, but they found that customers were actually putting it to other uses in terms of cleaning, and in particular using bicarbonate soda with white vinegar. So it's a really good idea to think about whatever it is you're utilising. Are there other uses for it before you change something, eliminate something, or reduce something? The E in Scamper stands for eliminate. So questions to ask when facilitating an ideation session to really generate some ideas would be questions like, what can we eliminate without disrupting the value that is perceived? So when we want to eliminate, we want to think about, well, is this going to decrease value or increase value, or will value be pretty much the same? We also want to know what it is that people don't value. Because if there's something that people don't value, we can ask the question, could it be eliminated? And we could also ask, is there anything that we could remove that wouldn't make any difference? Another way to ask the elimination question is to consider are there any areas that you're over-servicing people on? Because if you're perceived as over-servicing, then potentially if we reduced or eliminated this service or part of the service, you could potentially change the value proposition. An example of this, again, something reasonably commonplace that once wasn't commonplace, is the removal of animals at the circus. So these days when you go to the circus, there's not a lot of animals, or there's no animals. In most cases there's no animals, whereas once upon a time there were lots of animals at the circus. R, when we're talking about the R in Scamper, we're talking about rearrange. So questions that we might consider to generate ideas when facilitating an ideation workshop include, is there another way we could rearrange the workplace to make it friendlier? Or is there another way that we could rearrange things to make it more user-friendly? Or another question is, how can we reorganize things differently? What other ways can we rearrange things to add value, or to increase value, or to decrease value? Consider, can we reorganize the workflows? Does it have to workflow in that order? Can we reorder the way it works? Can we reorder the approval processes or rearrange the flow? Ask ourselves, what could we rearrange? Because some things we can rearrange, and often there are things that we can't rearrange without major ramifications. So an example of rearrange is on, for example, my iPhone. I love the fact that I can put all my apps and rearrange them into categories. So instead of having apps all over my phone, which used to drive me absolutely insane, I now have them categorized into little small groups so that when I'm looking for a particular app, it's so easy to find. And, you know, this was, you know, I've been doing this now for a few years, but this simplified my life just by allowing me to rearrange things. So this is a simple example of an idea that can be done using Scamper. So when we look at Scamper, again, we've got substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to other uses, eliminate, and rearrange. So that's 7 areas for us to generate ideas from within an ideation session. The benefits of Scamper is that you have a list of questions to ask of the participants in the ideation session, and that these questions possibly might prompt them to think differently. The Scamper ideation session can, as I said to you before, I would allocate 35 to 40 minutes, probably 40 minutes, allowing participants, 5 minutes per topic, as I mentioned. And I would probably do, to keep it to time, definitely groups of less than 6, ideally groups of 3 to 5 people I found works best. So if you're talking about a large group, what I normally do is I split them into smaller groups. And if I'm doing this in a round of different ideation sessions, what I will do is I keep swapping the groups around so that you don't always work with the same group of people, because then you start to get a little bit of groupthink happening. And you want to try and mix people up a little bit. So it's a really good idea to keep your groups small, because people feel more comfortable in sharing their ideas, and you get the people that typically dominate the conversation don't do it as much in smaller groups, and the people that are likely to let somebody else dominate the conversation, particularly your introverts, are more likely to contribute if they're in a smaller group, because it helps them to feel more comfortable. And that's both in an online environment and in a face-to-face environment. So if in an online environment, pretty much everyone's used to using rooms and putting people into different rooms, and the great thing about the online environment is that it makes it so much easier to do than it does in the face-to-face environment, is to randomly allocate people into groups. However, sometimes you can end up with the same few people depending on how the algorithm is working. Again, utilize the Scamper work map in the toolbox to help you to guide your facilitation process when facilitating a Scamper ideation workshop, and good luck.